A boy's fist struck a wooden post so hard the grain split down the middle. He was 7 years old. His knuckles didn't bleed. They never did. Around him, 6 other children stood in a perfect line, arms at their sides, breathing in unison. Not trained unison, natural unison, like their lungs shared one clock. An old man watching from a stone wall said nothing. He'd seen this before. His father had seen it. His grandfather before that. 7 families. 11 generations. Every child born in this valley moved the same way, fought the same way, even dreamed the same way. But this boy, something was wrong. His stance was off. His rhythm didn't match. For the first time in 300 years, one of the children was different. What that difference cost these families is something most of them wish had stayed buried. Stay with me on this one. Now here's what you need to understand about this valley. It sat in a deep fold of land in southern China's Guizhou province, ringed by limestone cliffs on 3 sides and a single dirt road on the 4th. No signs marked the way in. No maps showed it. And if you asked people in the nearest city, they'd shrug and change the subject. The valley had a name, but the families didn't use it with outsiders. They called it the Basin. And inside the basin lived 7 families. The Zhous, the Lins, the Tangs, the Chows, the Fens, the Huas, and the Sus. That's it. Nobody else. For more than 300 years, these 7 families had married only each other. Not by accident, by design, by rule, by a pact that went back to a single night in the late 1600s, when 7 martial artists, each the last master of a dying fighting style, gathered on a hilltop and made a decision that would shape every generation after them. They would combine, not their techniques, their bloodlines. The idea was simple and, at the time, it even made a kind of desperate sense. Each master feared that his art would vanish. Students abandoned tradition. Wars scattered lineages. So these 7 men decided that if they couldn't preserve their styles through teaching alone, they'd breed them into permanence. Each family would carry one art. Marriages between the families would blend the arts across generations. And no one from outside would ever be allowed in. The blood stays pure. The art stays alive. That was the pact. And for the first few generations, believe me, it worked. The children of the basin were extraordinary. By the 3rd generation, kids as young as 5 could perform techniques that masters in the outside world spent decades perfecting. Their reflexes were sharper. Their coordination was tighter. Visitors, the rare few who were allowed in during trading seasons, would watch these children spar and leave shaking their heads. One traveling monk reportedly said that the children didn't learn kung fu. They remembered it, like the knowledge was already inside them, waiting to be activated. By the 5th generation, the elders started keeping detailed records. Birth charts, training logs, marriage tables that mapped every union back to the original 7. These records filled an entire building. A stone hall they called the registry. The walls were lined with scrolls. The floors were stacked with ledgers. And everything in those records pointed to one conclusion. The pact was working. Each generation was stronger, faster, more precise than the one before. The families celebrated. They tightened the rules. They stopped asking whether any of it was natural. And they stopped listening to the handful of voices that had started asking uncomfortable questions. Because here's the thing. By the 6th generation, something else started showing up in those records. Something nobody wanted to talk about. Certain children were born with unusual features. Fused fingers, curved spines, eyes that didn't track together, teeth that grew in doubled rows. These were noted in the margins of the registry. Small handwriting, almost apologetic, as if even the person recording them felt ashamed to put it on paper. The elders explained them away. Training injuries, bad luck, a mother who ate poorly during pregnancy, a father who trained too hard and damaged his seed. Always an explanation, never the obvious one. But the numbers told a different story. In the 6th generation, 1 in 8 children had a visible defect. By the 8th, it was 1 in 4. And those were just the visible ones. The hidden problems ran deeper. Weakened immune systems, organs that developed too small or too large, Bones that broke under stresses that would barely bruise a normal child. The elders recorded these too. But they recorded them in a separate ledger, kept in a locked cabinet in the back of the registry. A cabinet that only the 7 family heads had keys to. And still nobody stopped. Nobody even slowed down. Because the children who were healthy, the ones who came out right, they were magnificent. Their fighting ability was beyond anything the original masters could have imagined. Some of them could anticipate an opponent's strike before the muscle even tensed. Others could match their breathing to an attacker's heartbeat and disrupt it with a single exhale. A Zhou child in the 9th generation reportedly dropped a grown man to his knees just by standing close to him and breathing in a specific pattern. These weren't tricks. These weren't legends inflated by time. There are written accounts. Witnesses. A Japanese delegation visited during the 9th generation and left a report describing children who fought as if they shared one mind. And that phrase, one mind, that's the one that kept coming up. Because by the 9th generation it wasn't just a figure of speech. The children had started finishing each other's sentences. Not occasionally. Constantly. A child from the Zhou family would begin a phrase and a Lin child across the courtyard would complete it without looking up. Mothers reported that their babies cried at the same time. Not just siblings. Cousins. Second cousins. Third cousins. Children who had never been in the same room. They would wake at the same hour, cry the same cry, and fall silent at the same moment. The elders called it harmony. They said it proved the pact was reaching its final form. The 7 were becoming one. This was the goal. This was what their ancestors had died for. But a few of the younger parents started using a different word. They whispered it to each other late at night, out of earshot of the elders. The word was erosion. By the 10th generation, the pattern had deepened into something you couldn't ignore even if you tried. Children didn't just share phrases. They shared memories. A boy would describe in perfect detail a room he had never entered. A girl would recount a fight she had never witnessed. And these weren't vague impressions or lucky guesses. They were precise, specific, down to the chip in a clay cup on a windowsill, down to the number of scratches on a sparring floor. The elders convened a council. 7 days of closed-door meetings in the registry. And when they emerged, their decision was absolute. Nothing was wrong. The bloodline was perfecting itself. The shared memories were proof that the ancestors lived on through the children. It was spiritual, sacred, beautiful, and anyone who questioned it would be expelled from the basin forever. So nobody questioned it, at least not out loud. The marriages continued, the training continued, and the 11th generation was born. This is where it turns. The 11th generation arrived like a mirror. 23 children born within the same 2-year span. And they were, there's no other way to put this. They were nearly identical. Not in the way siblings look alike. In the way copies resemble an original. Their bone structure, their gait, the way they tilted their heads when listening, the way their eyes tracked movement. If you lined all 23 up, you'd swear you were looking at one child reflected 23 times. Their fighting styles were flawless, perfectly synchronized. They could spar in groups of 7 and move as a single organism. No verbal cues, no hand signals, no counting. Just fluid, unified motion that looked choreographed but never was. The elders wept when they saw it. They said the pact had been fulfilled. 300 years of discipline, sacrifice, and faith. And the 7 arts had become one. But there was a moment of calm after that ceremony. The elders poured tea. The parents sat on stone benches in the courtyard and watched their children rest. A soft wind came through the basin. The training drums were quiet for the first time in weeks. Everything felt settled, complete. One of the older mothers even said aloud that she felt peace for the first time in her life. Like the valley itself had finally exhaled. Then a boy walked into the center of the courtyard and said 5 words that broke 3 centuries of silence. Where did the missing children go? His name was Chao Yuan. And he was the boy from the beginning of this story. The one whose fist split the training post. The one whose rhythm never matched. Now here's what happened next. And if this story has you leaning forward even a little, hit that subscribe button. Because what Ewan uncovered was worse than anything these families had imagined, and we're barely halfway through. Ewan's question didn't just land. It detonated. The courtyard went silent. The other children turned to look at him, and for the first time ever, their unified movement faltered. 22 heads turning at slightly different speeds. 22 faces showing something close to confusion, an emotion they had never individually felt before. The elders converged on Ewan fast. 2 of them grabbed him by the arms and hauled him out of the courtyard before he could say another word. But the damage was done. The question sat in the air and it would not leave. See, Ewan had been different from the beginning. His mother knew it the day he was born. He cried when no one else cried. He slept when the other babies were awake. And as he grew, the gap widened into something the elders could no longer explain away. The other children moved in unison. Ewan moved alone. They shared dreams. Ewan had his own. They fought in synchronized patterns. Ewan improvised, and his improvisation was better. He was faster than the synchronized children, less predictable, more creative. He didn't fight like a product of the pact. He fought like a person. And in the basin, being a person had become the most dangerous thing a child could be. The elders had pulled Ewan aside after his 7th birthday. They sat him in the registry, surrounded by 300 years of charts and bloodline maps, and told him something no child had ever heard. You are broken, they said. Your blood carries a flaw, but we will fix it. They assigned him special training. Longer hours, harsher drills, a single mandate. Learn to move with the others. Learn to breathe with them. Stop being separate. Ewan tried. For 2 years he woke before dawn and trained until his hands bled through the wrappings. He mimicked the synchronized patterns. He matched the breathing rhythms. And for brief stretches it seemed to work. He would fall into step. The elders would nod. Then, without warning, his body would break from the pattern. Not out of defiance. Out of something deeper than defiance. Something in him simply refused to merge. The night before his outburst, Ewan had done something no child was supposed to do. He'd gone to the registry after midnight, lit a candle and started reading. Not the training logs. Not the marriage charts. He went straight to the margins. The small handwriting. The notes that the elders had tried to make invisible. And what he found there was a record of silence. Children who had been born wrong. Children who appeared in one generation's chart and vanished from the next. Whole branches of families pruned from the record with no explanation. No death dates. No transfer notes. Just names that existed once and then didn't. Ewan counted 47 before he lost track. The elders locked Ewan in a small room on the eastern edge of the compound. No visitors. No books. For stone walls and a training dummy. They told the other children he was sick. That his blood had finally failed. That he would be treated and returned when he was ready. But one child didn't believe them. A Tang girl named Meili. She had been watching Ewan for years. Watching him break from patterns. Watching the way the elders watched him. And the night after Ewan was locked away, Meili did something no child of the 11th generation had ever done before. She acted alone. She crept out of her family's house, crossed the compound in darkness, found the door to Ewan's room, lifted the wooden latch, and sat down across from him on the cold stone floor. She said 4 words. I found them too. Meili had been in the registry weeks before Ewan. She had seen the same margin notes, the same erased names, but she had also found something he'd missed. Beneath the floorboards of the stone hall, hidden under a loose tile near the back wall, there was a second set of records. Older. Written in a hand that didn't match any of the 7 founding masters. These records weren't about bloodlines or fighting technique. They were medical observations. Clinical. Cold. Detailed descriptions of what had happened to the children's bodies and minds as the inbreeding deepened generation by generation. Fused bones. Organ failures. Seizures that came without warning and left children unable to speak for days. And something else. Something the author called convergence. The gradual collapse of individual brain patterns into a shared template. The children weren't developing harmony. They were losing differentiation. Every generation, the gap between one mind and the next grew smaller. The pact hadn't perfected the bloodline. It had compressed it, squeezed 7 lines into something approaching one. And that single template was becoming more fragile and more brittle with every child born. The 47 missing names, the records made clear, were children whose bodies had broken under the compression. Some had died young. Some had been carried to the nearest village and left on doorsteps. And some— Maylee's voice dropped when she said this. Some were simply never spoken of again. She didn't know what that meant, but she was afraid she did. Ewan listened to all of it in the dark. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Who wrote those records? Maylee shook her head. She didn't know. But the handwriting continued up through the 10th generation. Whoever the author was, they had been watching the destruction happen for centuries, documenting every detail, and hiding the evidence without ever once trying to stop it. Someone inside the basin had understood exactly what the pact was doing, and they had chosen to record the truth rather than speak it. Before dawn, Ewan and Maylee climbed the eastern wall and disappeared into the forest beyond the limestone cliffs. The elders sent trackers within the hour. For men from the Zhou and Sioux families, the best fighters the basin had ever produced. Their instructions were blunt. Bring the children back. Do not let them speak to anyone outside. Whatever it takes. The children had a 6-hour lead. They moved fast through terrain that should have been unfamiliar. But Maylee said later that her body knew the paths. Not from experience. From inheritance. The convergence that had taken so much from her had given her this one thing. An instinctive map of the land her ancestors had walked for 300 years. She didn't think about where to go. Her feet just went. Up through a narrow gorge. Along a creek bed that cut between 2 walls of rock. Over a ridge where the trees thinned and the sky opened wide. Ewan kept pace but barely. He wasn't used to running. Training in the basin was structured. Controlled. Nobody sprinted through forests at 4 in the morning. His legs burned. His chest hurt. But every time he thought about stopping, he thought about the room they'd locked him in, and his feet kept moving. By midday, they heard the trackers behind them. Not close, but not far enough. The sound of men moving through undergrowth carries in those mountains. Maylee grabbed Ewan's arm and pulled him off the trail into a narrow crevice between 2 boulders. They pressed themselves flat against the rock and held their breath. The trackers passed within. 20 steps. For men moving in perfect synchronization. Their footsteps landing at exactly the same moment. Their breathing locked to the same rhythm. Even from behind the rock, Ewan could feel the pull of that rhythm. His lungs wanted to match it. His body wanted to fall back into the pattern. He bit the inside of his cheek and forced himself to breathe on his own count. After the trackers had passed, Maylee looked at him. Her face was pale. She whispered, "They'll realize we're not ahead of them. We have maybe an hour." They changed direction, headed east instead of south. Maylee's instinct led them to a dry riverbed that cut through a gap in the limestone cliffs that the trackers apparently didn't know about. Or maybe they did but wouldn't think to check because no child had ever run this way before. By late afternoon, the sounds behind them had faded. They reached a village by nightfall. A real village. Electric lights. Strangers. A paved road that led to a city. Ewan had never seen a car before. Maylee had never heard music that wasn't a training rhythm. They stood at the edge of that road and just stared. 2 children from another century, blinking at the modern world. A man on a motorcycle slowed down and looked at them. They both flinched. He drove on. A woman carrying a basket of vegetables glanced at them and said something in a dialect they barely understood. The world outside the basin was louder and faster and more chaotic than anything they had been prepared for. They slept that night under a footbridge near the village school. Cold. Hungry. Maylee didn't complain. Ewan didn't sleep. He sat with his back against the concrete and listened to the sounds of a world that had been going on without them for 300 years. A schoolteacher named Zhang Wei found them the next morning, sitting on a low wall outside her classroom. Their clothes were torn. Their feet were cut from the mountain trail. Zhang Wei brought them inside without asking questions. She fed them rice and pickled vegetables and tea. And when Ewan started talking, she did what no adult in his entire life had ever done. She listened without interrupting. She didn't correct him. She didn't dismiss him. She didn't tell him he was confused. He told her everything. The basin, the 7 families, the pact, the registry, the missing children, the hidden records under the floorboards. Jiang Wei sat very still through all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she picked up a telephone and called a cousin who worked at a university in Guiyang. Within 3 days, a research team arrived at the village. Geneticists, anthropologists, a documentary filmmaker who had spent years investigating isolated communities in rural China. They interviewed Yuan and Meili separately, then together, then separately again. The details matched perfectly. Not rehearsed, just true. The filmmaker said later that in 20 years of documentary work, he had never heard a story told with such clarity by 2 children so young. They weren't embellishing. They weren't dramatizing. They were reporting. And the calm precision of their account was more disturbing than any exaggeration could have been. The team entered the basin with a local police escort. The elders resisted. The trackers had returned empty-handed, and the mood in the compound was hostile. Walls of silence. Doors latched shut. But the researchers had legal authority. And they had the hidden records. Meili had taken every page when she fled, rolled them into a bundle and carried them against her chest the entire way through the mountains. The elders couldn't deny what their own people had written in their own hand. What the team found confirmed everything in the hidden records and went further than anyone expected. DNA analysis of the 11th generation revealed a level of genetic homogeneity that the lead researcher described as unprecedented in any living population he had ever studied. The children's genomes weren't just similar. They were converging toward a single template. Unique markers that should have varied widely between individuals were nearly identical across all 23 children. Genetic diversity, the thing that protects a population from disease, from collapse, from extinction, had been ground down to almost nothing. The geneticists said it was as if the bloodline was trying to produce one person over and over again. Not a family, a single repeated individual. But what shocked the research team most wasn't the genetics. It was the neurology. Brain scans of the synchronized children showed nearly identical neural firing patterns. When one child was shown an image, the same regions lit up in every other child's brain, even children in separate rooms who couldn't see the image. The lead neurologist said she had studied identical twins for 20 years and had never seen anything like it. These weren't twins. They were 23 children from different parents. And their brains were operating on what amounted to a shared frequency. The convergence from the hidden records was real, measurable, and accelerating. Except in one child, Chao Yuan. His genome carried a spontaneous mutation, a random variation in a key regulatory gene that had somehow resisted the compression. His brain scans showed firing patterns that were entirely his own, unique, individual. The geneticist called it a breakpoint. Not a flaw, not a defect, correction, the kind of random variation that evolution produces to save a population from its own narrowing. Yuan's body had done what 3 centuries of elders couldn't. It had pushed back against the collapse. It had insisted on being different. And that insistence, that tiny genetic rebellion, was the reason Yuan could think his own thoughts, dream his own dreams, and fight his own way. The documentary aired on Chinese state television and later on international networks. It showed the children sparring in their eerie synchronization. It showed the registry with its careful charts and damning margins. It showed the hidden records mounted on display boards. And it showed Yuan, now 10, standing alone in the courtyard, demonstrating a fighting style nobody in the basin had ever seen. Not because it was ancient, because it was new. It was his. Built from instinct and improvisation and the stubborn fact that his body had refused to become a copy of anyone. The basin was opened. Slowly, painfully. The process took months. Government officials arrived first. Then social workers. Then more doctors. The families were given medical care, genetic counseling, and a choice that hadn't been offered in 11 generations. Marry whoever you want. Leave if you want. The pact is over. The reaction split the valley in half. The elders called a final council in the registry. They argued for 3 days. Voices carried across the compound. Some of them shouted that the pact was sacred and the outsiders were destroying what their ancestors had built. Others, mostly the younger family heads, said the pact had been destroying itself for generations and the outsiders had simply arrived in time to name the damage. By the third night, the council was deadlocked. Some elders refused to budge. 3 of the 7 families, the Zhous, the Huas, and the Sus, withdrew to the far end of the valley and kept their practices going in isolation. They couldn't let go. The pact was their identity, their reason for every sacrifice, every arranged marriage, every child given up. Admitting it had failed meant admitting that 300 years of suffering was built on a mistake. And some people will choose to keep suffering rather than face that kind of truth. The elder of the Zhou family reportedly said that the outside world was the disease and Yuan was the symptom. He never changed his mind. He died 2 years later in the far compound, still training children in the old way, still insisting the synchronization was beautiful. But the younger parents, the ones who had whispered the word erosion to each other in the dark, they brought their children out. One family at a time, quietly at first, then with conviction. Meili left permanently. She enrolled in school in Guiyang and never went back. The adjustment was brutal at first. She sat in a classroom full of children who had never heard of the basin and could barely understand her dialect. She struggled with math. She struggled with reading. The shared knowledge that had filled her mind since birth turned out to be useless outside the valley. She couldn't name a single province. She didn't know what electricity was called. But she learned fast, faster than anyone expected, because for the first time in her life, the things going into her mind were hers alone. Nobody else was thinking them at the same time. Nobody else was finishing the thought before she could. The shared signal faded over months. She described it later as a radio being slowly turned down. Some nights she could still feel the other children breathing in rhythm somewhere far away. A faint pulse at the edge of her awareness. But she could hear her own voice above it now. And that was the only voice she wanted to follow. Yuan stayed 2 more years in the basin. Not because the elders forced him. Because he felt he owed something to the children still stuck in the pattern. He remembered what it was like to be told you were broken. He remembered the room with 4 walls and no windows. And he knew that the other children hadn't chosen the pact any more than he had. They had been born into it. They deserved a way out. So he trained with them. Not in the synchronized way. In his way. Messy. Unpredictable. Full of mistakes and recoveries and moments where he'd lose his balance and laugh about it. The other children stared at first. Laughing during training was something none of them had ever seen. But slowly, one by one, they started to break rhythm. A Zhou boy threw a strike from an angle that wasn't in any of the 7 styles and then froze, startled by what his own arm had done. A Fan girl laughed during sparring. Actually laughed. Out of pure surprise at doing something her body hadn't already decided for her. A Hua boy sat down in the middle of a drill and said he was tired and didn't want to train today. The elders stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. Which, in a way, he had. The language of personal preference. These were small moments. Tiny cracks in a system that had held for 3 centuries. But in the basin, they were revolutions. Every time a child broke from the pattern and nothing bad happened, the pattern weakened. Every time a child made an individual choice and the sky didn't fall, the pact lost a fraction of its power. Yuan didn't preach. He didn't argue with the elders. He just moved differently and let the other children see that it was possible. The last time Yuan was filmed, he was 12. He stood in the courtyard alone, performing a form that pulled from all 7 original styles but obeyed none of their rules. His movements were uneven and unpredictable and alive with the kind of energy that only comes from a person discovering what their body can do when no one else is controlling it. A journalist asked what he called the style. Yuan thought about it. Then he said one word. Mine. That single word carried the weight of 300 years. Because in the basin, nothing had ever belonged to one person. Every technique was shared. Every breath was synchronized. Every dream was collective. The pact had tried to build perfection by erasing individuality. For 10 generations, it nearly succeeded. But a body pushed back. A boy asked a question, and the whole structure cracked. The basin is on maps now. A few families remain. Their children attend schools outside the valley and marry whoever they choose. The registry stands as a small museum. Visitors can see the charts on the walls, the margin notes behind glass, the hidden records on a display board near the back. And at the entrance, in a case by itself, there sits a wooden training post, split clean down the middle by a 7-year-old fist. Nobody knows exactly where Yuan is today. He doesn't give interviews. He doesn't perform. But every few years, a martial arts teacher in southern China will mention a young man who appeared at their school, trained quietly for a few weeks, and left without explanation. They always describe him the same way. He moves like no one else on earth. Not because 7 ancient arts flow through his blood, but because he became, against every rule and every generation of pressure and every chart ever drawn in that stone hall, the one thing the basin was never designed to produce. Someone entirely his own.